thing that still feels like a dangler for me is the concept of fourth dimension.
Yeah.
So by fourth dimension, do you mean versus third dimension and third chakra? So fourth dimension being heart chakra, or do you mean fourth dimension in a different context?
Yeah, I mean fourth dimension as far as heart chakra.
Okay. I think like it made sense because that's what we were talking about, but it wasn't clear to me if there was some other layer of meaning to it that you were expressing.
Yeah, it gets so tricky because when you shift to fourth dimension, it's no longer a spatial dimension. And I guess what I mean by that is, it's back to this thing of trying to explain it in 3D linear terms is so hard. But the idea is that instead of looking from a perspective, like I was talking about with converging lines and all that idea of a depth or a z-axis that creates this perceptual experience. When you're looking from third chakra, there's an experience of being an object in three-dimensional space that's looking out at the world. And the world is this three-dimensional spatial reality. And so there's an X, Y, and Z axis to it. When you shift to a fourth chakra lens, the experience is that you're looking from the space. And so you now see that object that you were looking from. And so it's, it's like third person versus first person. Where you're aware from is no longer that point in three-dimensional space. You're aware non-locally. And there's a weird thing where you'll read a lot in a lot of books where they'll say the fourth chakra, it actually goes back to a 2D experience somehow in our brain. It's like it starts collapsing back down, and it goes along that with that idea of the arc of evolution, or that idea of starting out with an experience of oneness, and then this separating out that reaches its climax in the personal 3D perspective, and then it starts making its way back towards the oneness. And so that the idea that three-dimensional linear space-time experience is kind of the peak of the separateness. So when you shift to fourth, now you're actually starting to make your way back towards unity, and the perceptual experience, which of course is how your mind is translating it, right? But so the experience goes back to this, like we were talking about the second chakra experience. You feel less separate in second chakra than in third, right? There's more of a merge with your environment, merge with others, merge emotionally. And then when you shift to fourth chakra, there's a merge or a being aware with, but the with is different in the fourth chakra than it is in the second. But again, that idea that they're both more of a group consciousness than the third is. Because if you just think of, if I try to make up an analogy here, it's like if right now as you're sitting there in your room, you could step out of your body and instead of stepping in and looking through your eyeballs, right, you could sort of back out of it and walk around, and you could be aware of yourself from an other position, or a witness, or non-localized awareness. And it's like, okay, you'd see the room and you'd see yourself, and you'd recognize that, well, that's me right there, right? But that's the chair, and that's the microphone, and those are the walls. But it's like we're not always locating ourselves, right?
Right.
And when you do come back to stepping in and looking out at world from that point in three-dimensional space, it's like that's a third chakra place. But if you could step out and kind of walk around, that it'd be more analogous to this fourth chakra thing. And so,
like in the fourth way, it's like being asleep versus being awake. What you're kind of referring to, that just this awareness of self outside of this localized perception of what's going on is a difference between being aware of life and being asleep to it.
yeah. So you're saying third is asleep and fourth is awake.
Yeah.
Like I've read stuff that talks about how a bunch of Picasso's work is fourth dimensional. And so, for example, he'll draw like a figure of a person, and the idea is that it's this representation of that person from several different angles, but kind of all at once in this image. Whereas I was talking last time about converging lines giving this sense of a third dimension added to that two-dimensional page that it's drawn on. And so this idea of Picasso doing these drawings that are representing or implying fourth dimensional perspective.
I hadn't thought about his art in that way. Like there's definitely like a spirit behind like what he's depicting, but as far as thinking about showing a fourth dimension as far as different aspects of the same person converging in one place beyond just like their physical location.
I think cubism is the word used for it.
Yeah. But it kind of undersells what's going on if it's more of what you're saying.
Right. And it's confusing because it's not like I was saying last time, if you're in two-dimensional, it's not like you got to sidestep all the time because there's no z-axis.
Right.
In fourth dimension, you're not seeing Picasso paintings everywhere. And, you know what I mean? Like
maybe some people are though. I mean, like you said, there's just different attunement to these frequencies, and I'm sure that the actual visual perception shifts from person to person to some extent.
Yeah, right.
It's like Chuck Close, the painter. It's just an analogy that where like he sees everything as almost distorted. So he has to do photorealism on a large scale and like get very close to what he's trying to draw and draw tiny pieces of it at a time, because otherwise it's just a blur of colors. Like when he looks at a face, he doesn't see any features of the face. He has to take a photo of it and then get like super close. His name's anyway, super near it, and then draw tiny pieces of it at a time. That there's just and like that's labeled a dysfunction to some extent, but like that's he's seeing something else there that other people aren't seeing.
What's his name?
Chuck Close. I'm pretty sure. Let me double check. The Walker has a huge self-portrait of his. Yeah, Chuck Close. So he'll he'll paint how he sees, and then he'll do photorealistic stuff too.
When I was saying I've had certain fourth chakra experiences where it looks like fourth dimension. For me, it's less spatial, and it's more like if you look at the paintings of Cézanne, I don't know if that's how you say his name, Paul Cézanne, my visual experience is more like that. The lines get a little blurry and the colors they kind of run into each other. And it's like there's this presence it's like the field itself has primacy, this intoxication experience where instead of the 3D objects seeming so separate, like I was saying with second to third, like if second is water and third is air, when you're in the water, it feels like a more immediate connection between you and the other things because the medium is denser or something, right? And in the fourth, it's actually not as dense as the third, but it paradoxically, it feels like it's a more connected medium with everything around.
Would you say it gets more confusing in that way?
It's more confusing to the three-dimensional intellect, for sure. Okay.
I meant as far as, because you mentioned, you kind of did the earthquake analogy in the last time we spoke, and the immediacy of feeling the ground shake if you're in first, right? And then also what you're talking about now, kind of the tangible differences in the water as things move around in the water in second.
Yeah.
And in the air, I would say it becomes, to me, there's like degrees of confusion there about where it's coming from. That like if you feel something in the ground versus in the water versus in the air, it can be less and less obvious where it's coming from. And then so if you're going up into this fourth dimension where you're saying it feels, despite being higher frequency, it feels more immersive in a way. Does it become even more confusing? Whose is whose? And I know there's an element of, again, of collective there. There's an element of group consciousness, like you're saying. But as far as distinguishing self and other, what does that look like there?
Yeah, I would say you could say it's more confusing to the three-dimensional ego, but it's the truth of it is that you're more clear that it's all yours. It's all everyone's. So it's more of a unified experience, and there's more clarity about that. So it's sort of less confusing. It's more overwhelming. It's kind of like mentally, it's much more clear that it's all yours and it's all mine, and you are me and I am you, and it's all ours. Emotionally, it's just a complete clusterfuck that has to try to get sorted out.
That's a good distinction.
My mom keeps telling me that I need to not drop the F-bomb on this podcast.
That's awesome.
She's a devout listener, but her critique always includes, and she has several critiques, but the use of the F-bomb is always one of the...
She has several critiques. That's going to be a different episode. My mother doesn't listen, so that'll be the episode right after that.
Like I was saying last time, you start doing fourth chakra stuff, and it does not take long before the lower chakras just yank you right back down. Yeah. We immediately shifted into like griping about our mothers.
Right. That's a good segue, though.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I wouldn't have put that together because I'm so like buried in it now.
Yeah, fourth chakra, it's a quick trip back. Like when you try to shift from third up to fourth, you'll quickly find yourself in second.
I think that's a really good point, though. You're talking about the kind of parallel nature of the two and just the interconnectedness. Because we talked about a little bit about it last time, that there's though first, second, and third are more about or are over and against, and there's a with of fourth. That with is similar to the with of second, and that tendency to merge there, and that there's parallel experiences. But what you're saying is that there's just obviously I would think with fourth an awareness of that what distinguishes it is the awareness of the individual self to some extent, even if just mentally, in relation to that merge experience of fourth. That there is a me that is being redefined through this interrelatedness. Does that distinction make sense?
Yes. I don't think this is contradicting anything you said, but it's not the second chakra lens, if you will, is not the same lens as the fourth, but now you're different looking through that lens. It's a different lens.
Yeah. So you come up into fourth, you feel this group consciousness, and then you get pulled back down into the lower chakras. And I think that this group consciousness becomes a driving force to re-understand or rethink self. It's almost like getting the energy to go and look at self again through this group consciousness. And so you could say like it's the gravity or the density of those lower chakras pulling you down. I think it's also the awareness pushing you down or giving you the ability to look down in a way that you couldn't before.
With any shift up in chakra, there's a, like I was making with the analogy of the earth, water, and air, you transcend it. You know, there's a transcendence where what you were caught in the lower level, what was a unsolvable dilemma, what seemed like death, what seemed like the end, when you look from the next higher dimension, you see that, oh, it's, you know, like I've used that analogy of if you're on a train track, you're stuck on that train track and there's an oncoming train. I mean, I'm going to drop the F-bomb. You're totally fucked, right? Like you don't stand a chance against that oncoming train. I mean, it's just over, you know, like you cannot, I mean, as much as you want to put up a fight, like that train's going to demolish you. And you can't outrun it either. And so you're just absolutely caught. And it's like, but if all you're aware of is that dimension of the train track, you're totally stuck if all you're aware of is that dimension of the train track. But if you jump to the next level of consciousness, you become aware that, oh, wait, you can go to the side. You can hop off the track. And it's like when you do that, okay, now it's no longer an issue. Like now the train going through there is just fine. And so the whole idea of how am I gonna contend with this train? It's like you don't have to. You just got to step to the side. But when you're stuck at the level where the problem is, you can't see that. And so it sounds corny, but there's that sense, and we all feel that when we've been, you know, like when you're talking with a kid, for example, who's just distraught about something, whether, you know, because, you know, like their balloon popped or their, you know, you take their little toy and you simply like hide it under the pillow and they think that the toy has like disappeared forever or something, you know what I mean? And it's cute because there's such an awareness that, okay, it's not the tragedy that the kid thinks it is. You know, it's almost sadistic the way it's like pleasurable to watch the child just absolutely freak out, you know, when they think their toy has like vanished forever, especially when they think that toy is self, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, an adult seeing it from this perspective where they know better. And so there's this love, there's this compassion, there's this sort of joy in the silliness of how deceived and caught one can be, you know, from a lower level. That's very different than just at that level trying to come to terms with it. So, for example, obviously the big one for most of us, this idea of actual physical death. Like, you know, in general, people are in denial about it. They block it out. They try to rationalize their way around it. Whether it's about your own death or about the death of loved ones, some people are just absolutely tortured by the loss of it, and it's that weird paradoxical thing where I think the truth is that at the first, second, and third levels, it's absolutely tragic. It's horrific. Death is physical death. The fact that, you know, there's these people that were alive and that now they're just gone, you know, I mean, and obviously often in very physically horrific ways, people die. And it's like, how could this possibly be okay? I mean, how do any of us come to terms with that, right? I mean, it's just, it's not okay. Unless there's some kind of other dimension to it, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of transcending death and arriving at some kind of love and compassion and acceptance and even appreciation for death, which doesn't make sense to the third chakra and below. It's not just that, oh, you grieve it down to its bottom and then you're over it. It's like, no, there's some kind of intuitive, conscious knowing about the nature of death, and a knowing, not just an idea, but a knowing that it's not the end, and that there's actually something in it that's quite beautiful and quite a relief, quite a that it's a death on one end, but it's a birth simultaneously, to a different experience.
That Ram Dass would say that death was like taking off a very tight shoe.
Yeah,
it's like a shoe that's 4 sizes too small, and then just the relief you're talking about,
right?
The birth or the opportunity that's there.
So that experience when I'm working with clients, for example, it's the same when I'm working with myself, but I mean, it's just this constant practice of okay, I look in a certain way and I see, for example, a certain energetic pattern that I see the client caught in and suffering. I see they're suffering this pattern. And of course I'm wanting to help. I'm wanting to help because I just have that inclination to want to, I think most of us, we see someone suffering in some way, we want to help. I want to help because they're in my office paying me to get help.
Right. There's multiple layers of motivation.
Right. And so, I find myself the ego reaction or the tendency would be, okay, to kind of effort harder and go into a mode of, okay, how do I fix this? How do I change this? How do I, what's the strategy here and what's the agenda and how do I figure out what's happening? And as I've talked about before, over the years, doing this all day, every day for so many years, I've gotten more and more practiced at it's to be conscious of that pattern and then accept it, allow it, let it be what it is, hold conscious awareness around it as if the pattern was perfect and awesome and it was going to be that way, meaning not only the pattern but the client's suffering was going to be that way for eternity. And I'm sitting and sort of appreciating the beauty and the like profound sacredness of this client's pattern, which is sort of like if you're sitting there watching someone with their leg caught in a bear trap, and to go into that state, it would seem sadistic and insane, as they're like, will you help me out of this fucking trap, get my leg out of this trap.
But isn't the trap well built?
Right. Yeah. And of course, that's how it is from the fourth chakra and up. From the third chakra, that's not what I'm thinking or doing. But in the fourth chakra, that's sort of what it seems like, and that gets into a lot of I think the Jesus teachings that one could argue there's a lot of fourth chakra concepts.
At some point, we're going to have to get into differentiating, first through third is different than fourth as far as your holding of it. Would you say, is that true, or am I mishearing what you're saying?
That the experience is different?
It sounded like you said the treatment is different or the approach is different.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's that weird thing where it's like, okay, because on a, let's just say a third chakra level, I'm very much intending to fix them. Meaning fix their back pain, fix their knee, fix their the tensegral issue that's happening in their body, fix the mindset that they're caught in, So on that level, it's a fixing, it's a changing. There's an agenda. And paradoxically, it's okay, well, how do you fix that? And one of the ways is to bring in this certain kind of attention, not third chakra, I'm just going to let it be what it is, but more of a, for example, a non-dual awareness and or a fourth chakra awareness, consciousness, a third eye consciousness, higher self-consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're going to translate those transpersonal or fourth chakra and above or non-dual types of experience, if you're going to translate them into rational language, then the rational language is such that you'd say you're fixing by not fixing. You know, it's this whole idea of acceptance-based therapies. It's like, what the hell does that mean? You know, and it's like, well, you're accepting the dysfunction, and then paradoxically, that fixes the dysfunction. And so again, it's just because it's not rational. It's not linear. You can't. If conscious awareness is warm water, and the fixation or the contraction or the pattern is an ice cube, you know, it's like you just put the ice cube in the warm water, and or you bring warm water to the ice cube. You bring conscious awareness to the ice cube, and then you just let it sit in your accepting, open awareness. And the ice cube melts.
Obviously, like the dimension approach is a series of things that you do regardless of what's going on. But I hear the distinction you're making between fourth and third chakra. I don't know if it's fixations, but things you're working with.
Right.
That it's easier to bring rational language to third chakra issues.
Right.
That it's easy, like you're saying. But even though the approach itself requires fourth chakra consciousness or that holding to be most effective requires something beyond rational third chakra language.
Right. It's funny, you know how there's a lot of use of the word weaponize in recent times?
Yeah.
You know, it's like you can weaponize almost, I mean, I think it's true, you can weaponize anything, right? But there's this idea of fixing someone's back or helping someone's body, or, you know, it's like the dimension approach is about weaponizing conscious awareness. It's being used as a tool, as a weapon, against distortion, against pain, against, you know, and you could say against evil.
Back to John Constantine.
Yes, right. But that, I mean, you know, and it sounds corny, and this is jumping into deeper therapeutic work, but what people come up against is their unconsciousness, and the unconscious is dark and what a lot of people would say, evil. And it's like, well, what do you do about that? Right? Well, the typical thing, meaning what one's ego does, is it contracts. It fears, it blocks, it represses. And the idea that going the other direction, relaxing, opening out, allowing, accepting from that third chakra or ego awareness, it's like, no way. Why would you do that? And it's like, well, because if you do that and then reveal it to higher consciousness, then the higher consciousness can get at it. So it's sort of like opening up a wound so that the infection can be gotten at, right? So that oxygen, for example, can get at the infection. But it's this dangerous game, because if you don't have conscious awareness there and you open up or allow too much, then you can just get more possessed. And so there's that constant battle between how much should one allow stuff from their unconscious to surface, allow it to be spoken about, allow it to be felt, allow it to be enacted, versus how much should you just repress it and put it away. And of course, it's, the simple model is that, there needs to be enough conscious presence in order for it to be safe enough to do so. And that's not an exact science, obviously.
What does it look like when, because I imagine you're obviously facilitating a greater container than someone can provide for themselves for those types of experiences through one-on-one sessions. Mm-hmm. What does it look like for someone? Because I think thinking about how we're talking about subtle energy and chakras, that as people like work to bring awareness to these, I think things are going to come up like what you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. That what does it look like for something to come up that you may not have a container for?
Well, it can look like a lot of things. When someone is triggered, for example, so someone gets real reactive and blows up, has a tantrum, says shit they wouldn't normally say, goes into a projective or borderline state where they're, you just can become aware, like, okay, this person has regressed, right? So regression happens. You can become aware that there's another word that can be used as possession, that they're possessed right now by an emotion, by an idea. If it gets intense enough, or if you have that kind of awareness, you can see that there's an actual imaginal realm possession happening. It's very similar to like someone getting too drunk. We've all seen people where, they're just drunk enough or high enough or loaded enough on some psychedelic where it's like, okay, they're no longer, their quote unquote normal self is no longer in the driver's seat. And it's this very tricky, weird thing, this shift. I'm talking about it all the time, but it's very deceiving and tricky. If you say that, if just sort of if this simplified model is that you have body, mind, and soul. Soul is, or if you don't like soul, conscious awareness or whatever, higher self. But this idea that there's all these energies that we can be possessed by, influenced by, motivated by, and that our ego mind is managing them. And whether you want to think of the energies as pre-existing the ego mind, or whether you want to think of the energies in the ego mind being a one unit that just has different aspects to it, which would be the difference between the drive model and the relational model in psychology, Freud and Fairbairn. For all you psychology geeks out there, just that relationship that we all know within ourselves, where it's like, okay, there's what we think of as body, and there's what we think of as mind, and there's these impulses, desires, thoughts, fears that are arising, so to speak, in our mind, and then our mind is deciding what to do about them, what to just act on, what to deny, what to repress, what to sublimate, and then in certain situations, for example, like when you start getting more and more intoxicated, you start getting less and less inhibited, right? Your inhibitory mechanism in the mind starts lessening and lessening, and so now you become more and more willing to behave or allow or enact the energies that are coming up. And so there's that relationship, right? And so generally speaking, we're all living our lives in that, and that's what Freud called psychic conflict, and you're either behaving yourself or you're not, right? According to your societal standards. So what I'm getting at is, when you bring in this idea of soul, in order to let soul take over, you have to let soul take over the job of the ego or the mind. And I'm not saying ego as in false ego persona. I'm talking about the actual ego, meaning your authentic mind that manages body or id or whatever you want to call it. And it's this very scary, dicey thing because we don't trust that our soul is going to come in and take care of things. We're identified with our mind, not our soul. And it's like, it seems like it'd be great if soul just came down and came in contact with mind and said, don't you worry, I've got it all taken care of. You can just relax and step aside or let me come down and embody you. And I can handle anything that body can dish out. Whereas, by the way, you can't. Meaning, you, the ego mind, cannot. All you can do is either repress it or be possessed by it. Those are your two modes. And it's like,
if you hadn't noticed,
yeah,
that's how it's been going.
Hadn't noticed. Yeah, you're a two-trick pony. And so it's like if soul would come in and just take over ego mind and again become one with it, and then all the concern and fear and conflict would resolve, right? And there could just be this perfect management of the body energies. But that's not how it works. Instead, the ego mind, or at least I've never seen it work that way. It's like we were talking about the waking up and growing up. It's like this is a similar thing where it's like, well, I've never seen anyone grow up before they woke up.
Even Jesus had to go into the desert for a while.
Exactly, right. Right. And he had to die on the cross in order to, have that higher, in order to become a Christ, right?
Right. Well, yeah, we get back to what Christ means, but
yeah. I'll argue with you about that. So this thing where it's like, in order for your soul to get at it, so to speak, your ego mind has to allow that possession to happen. Because if your ego mind's sitting there fighting off the possession, then your ego mind isn't letting the body energies come up into it, so to speak. And I see this all the time. And, it's like you can feel angry, but the anger is underneath, right? It's in there. It's in your body. It's in your field. But there's this place in your mind that's actually in resistance to it, because that place in your mind is trying to resist being absolutely possessed by it. Because the fear is if you do that, you don't know what's going to happen. And that's a real concern. If you let go of that place in your mind, you might kill yourself. You might kill other people. You might go totally psychotic and either end up in the hospital or do some real damage, right? So it's a real serious thing that there's this pressure and flood of certain vibratory energetic experiences, and then the ego mind is locked down in a resistance to being totally possessed by him. And like I'm saying, for good reason. And then you get into a therapeutic environment of the type I'm talking about, where one's actually working with depth, is doing depth work or is doing transformational work or is doing imaginal work or is doing deep relational psychoanalytic type work. And the idea is, okay, this environment is going to manage you right now. Now go ahead and let the possession happen. It's sort of the rubber room idea, it's let's create a safe enough environment and then, okay, go ahead and cut it loose. And of course, it's easier said than done. The client can't just suddenly choose, okay, yeah, I feel safe enough now. Now I'm going to go ahead. We can do that with some stuff. I mean, you can get a punching bag in front of you and it's like, okay, now it's safe to just unload and beat the shit out of this punching bag. But there's experiences we have in us that we're terrified of ourselves. And we certainly don't trust the therapist to be able to hold it or manage it. We certainly don't trust the therapist is going to still think we're a good person after we let this happen. And so we just live in this terrible conflict with it. But at the same time, consciousness can't get at it until you let that happen. You can't just witness body from soul and then just take care of it from there. At some point, the ego mind has to come into play and has to open up to those energies, because the ego mind is if you just think of it as like an electrical system, it's like the ego mind is that connection point between body and soul. And in general, my experience is that what our society does is walks around being the ego mind, which is wrong. It's false. The ego mind is leading, it's driving. We've gone backwards, I think, from where the theories of 100 years ago when Nietzsche and Freud and Jung and all these guys were presenting this kind of paradigm. Meaning we've gone backwards in the field of psychology. We've gone backwards, I think, with our culture in general. And, we're in more of a denial of nature, denial of body, denial of spirits than ever. We're glorifying and identifying ego mind as identity more than ever. We're making ego mind and its various ideas about identity absolutes. We're going the opposite direction from what I'm talking about as far as trying to allow body and soul to integrate. We're just beefing up and solidifying and crystallizing ego mind more and more and more.
And that's become the cultural context for state experiences of these higher energies we're talking about.
Right.
So the like you were saying, or like we've talked about at different points along the way, that if you have a state experience of, so let's just say fourth chakra, of this collective consciousness, of this this group consciousness, and your container for it is this super rigid, super culturally enforced ego perception of yourself that you're operating from, that is going to define what you think that group consciousness is. So there's a way in which that these experiences are always available, and just the awareness that our current state is going to inform how we interpret them. So I think it's just another good reminder as we're going through talking about these different chakras, these different points, these different experiences, these different frequencies, to be aware of what our container for them is.
Yeah, which is a good way to put it, that discerning which container is different than what is the interpretation.
Right.
Which again is that same concept as when I'm saying what window do you have open on your screen versus what's the content in that window.
Yeah.
They're both important, but they're two different things.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.